Stephen Vantassel. You're listening to Living the Wildlife, discussing all things related to vertebrate pest control as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant and Pest Geek podcast with Living the Wildlife podcast. Always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and or other control methods to manage pests. Wildlife Control Consultant, LLC, Pest Geek Podcast, Living the Wildlife Podcast, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here. Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing you another episode of Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek Podcast family. Glad to have you on board. I hope your week went well. Mine was quite busy, involved with a lot of training. Not so much training for me, but as I was giving training for others, and so I always enjoy that kind of work. And so had some responsive people, which is always helpful. So glad to have been back home and getting ready for yet another week. So do take a few moments, if you would, to subscribe to the channel, ring the bell, and give us a 5-star review. It would be most appreciated as well, so we can get the word out to more people. You can also reach out to me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Love to hear your comments, questions, thoughts, suggestions for new shows. Perhaps you want to be a guest on the show. We'd love to have you. You can reach out to me again at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Join us as well on Facebook with Pest Geek Podcast Family, as join the revolution, as Franklin likes to call it. So we can definitely be there where you can talk about your triumphs and trials and just share, talk all things vertebrate and pest control with felt like-minded individuals, and we'd be glad to have you there as well. Well, this week I thought I would talk about a problem that probably many of you may have encountered, but didn't really have a good solution for your clients. As you know, it is important for us as professionals to be sure that we're helping our clients solve the problem, so that we're not just getting into a situation where we're constantly just in the killing zone. Now, for those of you that are pest controllers, clearly insects are of a different situation, but in terms of vertebrate control, we can often, if our clients follow our instructions, we can often be in a situation where the client will never call us again. And that's one of the challenges with vertebrate pest control, but it's one of the realities that we have to deal with. That's why there will always be more pest control operators, because obviously there's far more biomass in insects than there is in vertebrates. And insects have a significantly higher reproductive rate, and they can swarm, and they can get into smaller crevices. Vertebrates obviously have larger holes that they need to get into, and so it is really possible to exclude a structure from access with vertebrates. That may be significantly harder to do against insects, and plus people bring in insects into the structure. So even if you have a pest-proof house, let's say, your bag of groceries could bring in insects into the building that obviously would permeate that particular structure. So things are different. Although we have a lot of analogies with the pest control field, vertebrate pest control is still different. So we're cousins, maybe even half-brother, half-sister, but we're not identical. And so one of the things that we need to do as professionals in terms of vertebrate control is to help our clients resolve a problem so that we're not just simply in the business of killing our way to success, which often is a loser's bargain anyways, even though it may be profitable to have a client where you're just charging them for years. I know of one situation where the client was being charged 10 years to manage a particular problem. And I'm not saying necessarily that I thought they were being ripped off. The client knew what they were getting, but it wasn't doing the job. And so you need to sometimes do something different for your client. You know, if something's not getting the level of success, how hard are you looking for something different? Or is it just because you're not offering something different because of a philosophical reason on your part? So you need to kind of work through some of those issues, but that's probably the subject of another podcast indeed. So how do we help clients resolve these conflicts? Well, clearly, habitat modification is important. So you're going to be helping them talk about removing, modifying bird feeders. You're going to talk about taking care of trash cans, reducing water. And you're going to tell them about branches, etc., leaning over buildings and cutting them back and making it harder for animals to access the structure through climbing. Well, that's all well and good, and that's very important that you do, and I don't want to diminish that. However, you do need to be sure that you recognize that sometimes animals are using electrical wires or other forms of wires to access structures. How do we help clients prevent animals from climbing that? That is a much more difficult situation. I used to call squirrels that climbed on wires, I call them wire walkers. And I thought it was really cool because they would use these means at times to access structures. So even though there wasn't necessarily any tree branch close enough to the building that they could jump from, they would access the structure walking the electrical lines, or they could do a cable line or some other form of line. And this can be a real problem for people. Obviously, not everyone has that problem. But for those that do, what can we offer them a solution to stop animals from accessing the structure via that means? And thankfully, the answer is yes. Now, a couple of caveats need to be considered here. Never, ever, ever, ever do anything near an active power line. I believe, if memory serves, the requirement is somewhere for a line going to a house. I think the recommended distance to stay away from it is like 6 feet. It might be 10. My understanding is with electrical companies is that obviously if you're dealing with high tension wires, the distance is significantly greater, and then it gets shorter and shorter as you get farther down the substation and the intensity of the electricity, obviously. Nevertheless, understand that electricity going to a house, even though it's been reduced in terms of its intensity, it can still kill you. Okay, so never, ever, 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 I gotta repeat this enough because people do stupid things, right? So don't do it. We all know of situations where squirrels have gnawed in around power lines, right? So you can't do anything with that until you're contacting your local electric company, and they will come out and either take the power off or they will insulate it to a sufficient extent so that it is safe for you to operate around. And you have got to be sure that you know exactly what that requires. Ladders can be lightning rods, especially if you're dealing with aluminum. It's going to be a little safer if you're dealing with fiberglass. Nevertheless, don't trust any of that stuff, okay? So be very, very careful. So that deals with electrical lines. But there's a lot of lines that may go to a structure, such as a cable line that is not electrified. And so that is something that you could use. What do you do about a situation when squirrels are walking that line or rats are walking that line? How do we stop that? How do we prevent animals from climbing poles as well? So is there a way that we can prevent the squirrel or rat from climbing the pole in the first place? And the answer is, thankfully, yes. And so I want to tell you about this particular company and to let you be aware of it so that this is something you can work with. This company is called Critterguard. It's Critterguard, Critterguard. And this particular company, of course, manufactures protection for electrical lines. And if you're aware of what happens with electrical lines, squirrels and rats are notoriously hard on electrical lines, and they cause a significant amount of power outages because they like to gnaw on the rubber around that particular line, as well as they'll sometimes connect two lines together as they're crawling around. And so this can be a real problem, and it causes electrical companies to sustain a lot of damage, both in lost electricity as well as the need to repair. And so it's a significant problem. So this particular company manufactures these devices that help prevent animals from using power lines as well as poles. And so the first product that they have is called Line Guard. Let me kind of blow that up a little bit more for you, for those of you watching online. Now, Line Guard is kind of an interesting thing. And so it basically consists of a ring that goes around the line, and it's at both ends. And what that does is that forces the animal to stop and then jump or climb over that particular barrier. Once it does that, that destabilizes the animal. So then when he tries to reach down and grab one of those little pill-shaped tubes, he's already destabilized. And the beautiful thing about those tubes is that they spin. Really interesting. So that the idea being is that the animal's crawling along the wire, reaches the screen barrier, has to jump over it, and as soon as it hits that pill-shaped tube, those spin independently of each other. And so now the animal has to not only grip something that's wider, it's also smooth, and it's spinning, and then it finally plummets to below. So even if it survives the initial jump, it still has to navigate its way across, 5 separate, independently spinning tubes to get to the end, and then has to jump again to get onto the wire. It is simply a bridge too far. And it is a fascinating device. Now you may say, well, why is this initial barrier, that screen barrier, screen? Why wouldn't it be solid? Well, I believe the reason for that is because of wind. Wind can really pick up at elevation, and so by having it screened, the animal's able to see through. Of course, that's a downside of it, but the other advantage is it doesn't provide as much wind resistance, and so it's not going to get buffeted by heavy wind. Like where I live, we get some heavy winds, so things would get trashed pretty quickly that way. So it is a fascinating device. So let's check this out a little bit more. There's sort of a blow-up of it for you. And these are the basic parts of it. So notice how it basically can snap around that particular wire, and you can buy additional rollers, and then you have bracket kits that you can buy as well. Then they have stainless steel cable ties. So this is something that's going to last for a while. Not cheap. However, given the technical nature of the product, it is something that is well worth purchasing because it's a very specialized device. Now, just to reiterate, this is something you will not be installing on an electrical line. That is something only for a qualified professional to be installing. However, it is something where you can at least let your client know, and either you want to be the middleman or you want to have your client contact the electric company. The client could easily purchase one of these and ask the electric company or a qualified electrical person to install it. I think for most power line systems, it has to be done by the utility because it's their property. But you can certainly call. You will find that electrical utility companies are very customer friendly. They want to be helpful, but they don't want people doing dangerous things, and they certainly don't want to be doing things that harm. And they would be open. I'd be pretty confident in saying this is nationwide. They would be open to having this problem, installing this particular device to solve a problem for a client, provided the client, obviously purchases it and makes it available. There may be a fee to have the person come out, or there may not be a fee. I don't know. But nevertheless, if your situation is serious enough, once you start you want to stop squirrel access or stop rat access from using those power lines, this is clearly a solution that will be long-term. And in terms of what it costs to hire a professional to come out and keep removing animals, it's probably going to be worth your while to even if you have to hire the utility company to install it. So when you're looking at, $135, let's just call it $200. If you throw in shipping and maybe some additional rollers, and then having it installed, what's the utility company going to charge? Another $200-$300 to install it? Because it's a lot of things are just sort of snap on, and you're kind of good to go, and it's pretty easy to work with. So certainly this is something you want to consider. Now, if you're dealing with a line that is not electrified and don't guess, make sure you're absolutely certain it's not an electrical line, okay? Then you can certainly install this yourself. Maybe someone has a clothesline that squirrels keep using. This is a device that could be used on that, depending on the situation. There may be cable lines that are used. There may be other types of lines. Maybe a line to hold a particular vertical object. Maybe a stabilizing wire is being used. This could be something that would be applicable for that as well. So again, check it out. Contact the company. Look into the line guard system produced by Critterguard. All right. Well, let's have a look at, let's see what we have here. See if we show you some other photos. Here are the types of situations that they think this product works for, which is sort of surprising to me. I didn't think snakes could climb power lines and poles. Well, certainly they can climb poles. I didn't think about them using power lines per se. Certainly rats and squirrels, but obviously raccoons and possums can do some climbing as well. But I think of that more as the pole issue rather than the line issue. So let's take a look at Pole Guard. This is the device that's installed on typically telephone poles, and this is designed to prevent animals from accessing that. So as you can see, the same principle applies. It is installed around the pole itself, so it creates a barrier. So now the animal has to sort of hang 10 around it, and then it has to reach those spinners, those pill-shaped devices, and each of those spin. So as the animal is trying to hold on to the pole and reach out around and grab to try to pull himself up, those spin and the animal's unable to do it. Now, one of the downsides of this is, as I'm looking at this, is obviously it's going to be useful for some larger animals. You'd have to be sure that when you install it, it is tight enough against the pole that the animal's not going to just be able to squeeze by it. But certainly if you're dealing with situations such as raccoons or possums, these are devices that this pole guard is clearly a device suitable to prevent them from climbing that pole. So this is something you may want to talk to the manufacturer about, Critterguard, and say how maybe there's a way that you would need to install it to prevent snake access or rat access, smaller animals from climbing that pole, and I'm sure they would be more than willing to help you out. Now, are there other ways of resolving this? And the answer is yes. You can certainly consider using aluminum flashing around a pole, and if ideally for something like a raccoon or a squirrel, you need to have at least 3 feet in width to prevent them from climbing. You need to install the flashing at minimum at chest height or above to force the animal to commit to the pole. If your flashing is not wide enough, then your flashing needs to be overlaid so that you, like shingles, where you would put the base in first and then overlap it by circumventing the pole above it. So that way the wrapping above is over the wrapping you've done below. So otherwise, you're going to have a ridge that the squirrel is going to be able, or raccoon's going to be able to grip, and you don't want that. You want the ridge going down, not facing up. And you need a minimum of 3 feet to prevent them from having grip. And the aluminum prevents them from being able to get their claws in. Now, with raccoons, they may be able to still grip that by using enough force, but with squirrels won't be able to do it. So perhaps with other animals, such as perhaps a snake or something, that may be too difficult unless they can wrap around the entire pole, because a snake still needs to be able to push off against something that's sort of rough enough, or it has edges for them to push against in order to get enough traction to climb something like that. So this is one of the challenges. That's where the aluminum flashing. So I'd love to get your feedback on that. Those of you that may have had some success or non-success. I'm more familiar with the use of aluminum flashing to prevent squirrels from climbing. And that would also, of course, prevent rats as well. But in terms of raccoons have a little bit more ability to kind of use just force, gripping something with just pressure rather than having to get their claws into it. So that is certainly, they just sort of palm it rather than fingernail it to climb. And so that is one of the disadvantages with raccoons. But if you have a large enough, a wide enough tree or something, that may be very difficult for them to kind of put that kind of effort in. They may need to grip a little bit more to get enough upward momentum. But of course, you're still also making it a hassle. Sometimes we don't need to make something animal proof to work. We just need to make it better, harder for them to access this pole than another pole. And sometimes it's like the roller repellent. Sometimes the repellent doesn't stop all damage. It just makes it difficult enough for the animal so that they go to someplace easier. And that's kind of what we need to be thinking about sometimes when we're thinking about exclusion. What are the neighbors doing? And I know in our industry, we're always thinking about, we want something 100%, and that's certainly a worthy goal, but sometimes that goal is a little bit too much, and it's just not practical in many situations. So we have to sometimes have realistic expectations that sometimes the best we can do at a cost-effective rate is just make things difficult if we can't do it as impossible. So some thoughts there. So I want you to check out the company Critterguard. They make pole guard as well as the line guard system. Check them out, and certainly it's something that may add another tool to your toolbox. Do follow all the safety requirements. Be very, very careful around electrified lines. That's deadly. People can easily die from becoming electrocuted. So make sure you are using these appropriately and knowing when you need to hand this off to a professional who knows what they're doing. And power lines need to be dealt with by utility professionals, not you. But having a possible solution for your clients is part of being a professional, helping them resolve a particular problem, and now you're aware of this company, Critterguard. So just in terms of myself, I make no money off this company. I have no contractual relationship with them. They were kind enough, probably 10 years ago by now, maybe even more, kind enough to send me a sample when I was at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and I was particularly impressed with it. So I want you to make you aware of it. It's certainly a niche problem, but that's what makes us professionals, right? We know things that the average client's not going to be aware of, and this may be a way to really solve their issue and give them some long-term management of these climbing mammals. So wish you all well. Again, this is Stephen Vantassel, Wildlife Control Consultant. Do take a few moments if you would. You can drop me a line at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Let me know what you think about the show, some thoughts about future shows. I'd love to hear about them. And if you're interested in being on the show, perhaps you have a new product or service that you're offering, I would love to have an interview there. You can, I'm pretty easy to get along with. It is sort of surprising to me how many people are afraid to be interviewed. I'm not sure why. I would think you would want to be able to talk about your product and service, but people are certainly different. You can also take a few moments, if you would, to subscribe to the channel, ring the bell, and give us a 5-star review. It'd be most appreciated. For those of you that don't like dealing with YouTube, you can certainly download my podcast, of course, at rumble.com. And just go to Wildlife Control Consultant. Well, this is another episode of Living the Wildlife. Why do we call it Living the Wildlife? Because we want you to live the wildlife, not be the wildlife. Take care, everybody.